Chapter 1. Elias's village and the legacy of his grandfather. In a small village nestled between towering mountains and vast green fields, life flowed peacefully like the calm waters of a river. The sound of gentle winds, the singing of birds at dawn, and the fresh scent of the countryside marked this place. It was an isolated village where everyone knew each other and cared for one another. Life seemed to be in perfect harmony with nature here. For Elias, however, this serenity was forever marked by the absence of his parents, who passed away when he was just a child. His parents, though humble, were beloved by everyone in the community, known for their kindness and love that they spread wherever they went. Elias grew up without them, but with the memories of a house filled with laughter and warmth. His grandfather, a shepherd, became his greatest support and guiding figure. With white hair and hands weathered from hard work, the old shepherd was a rock of wisdom for the young boy. He didn't just guide the sheep across the field. He also guided Elias with comforting words and deep teachings. "The Lord is our shepherd, and we shall not want," he would often say, a constant reminder that faith should be the foundation upon which Elias built his life. To Elias, these words were more than just Bible verses. They were living promises that helped him overcome the everyday challenges he faced. When Elias was still a boy, the land where his grandfather tended the sheep was green and vibrant. The earth seemed to never tire of producing fruits, and the hills, which stretched endlessly, were always covered with wildflowers. His grandfather's flock was healthy, the sheep fat and content, and the small cabin they lived in radiated warmth and hospitality. Over time, Elias grew accustomed to working beside his grandfather. He helped care for the sheep, fed the animals, and on rainy days he would sit by his side, listening to stories of ancient shepherds and their journeys across the mountains. His grandfather taught him about the importance of patience, being wise in his choices, and trusting fully in God, just as a shepherd trusts his flock. But as with all stories, Elias's peace with his grandfather would not last forever. Life, with its unexpected turns, brought the young boy and his grandfather's constant presence to an end. When Elias turned 18, a tragic event occurred. His grandfather fell ill. The illness came quickly, leaving him weak and vulnerable. Elias, who was beginning to understand the responsibility that awaited him, dedicated himself tirelessly to caring for his grandfather, trying to reverse the situation, but to no avail. In just a few months, Elias's grandfather passed away. The young man, now without the constant companionship and guidance of his grandfather, was devastated. The emptiness he felt was not just physical, but emotional and spiritual. The man who had taught him everything he knew about faith, life, and responsibility was no longer there. Elias felt lost, like a sheep without a shepherd. Chapter 2. The weight of loss and the burden of responsibility. After the death of his grandfather, Elias stood in the small cabin they had shared for so many years, staring at the empty chair where the old shepherd had once sat. The room, once filled with stories and laughter, was now silent, as if mourning the loss of its only remaining soul. The weight of the absence felt heavier than anything he had ever experienced before. Elias knew that life would never be the same. The once close-knit village seemed distant now, as if the bonds he had with everyone were fragile, like the brittle branches of trees in the fall. The village, which had always been a place of comfort and support, now felt like an empty space, echoing only with the sound of his footsteps. His heart was heavy with grief and confusion. Without his grandfather's guidance, Elias was unsure of the next step. He was no longer a child, yet he felt unprepared for the challenges that awaited him. As the days passed, Elias tried his best to keep up with the work his grandfather had done. He tended to the sheep, worked the land, and repaired fences that had fallen into disrepair. But the task was monumental. The land, which had once been fertile and full of life, now seemed dry and barren. The crops failed, and the once thriving flock of sheep began to grow weak. Elias could feel the land slipping away from his grasp, as if the very earth itself was mourning the loss of his grandfather. His heart grew heavy with each passing day. He felt the weight of the responsibility pressing down on him. He had no one to turn to, no one to ask for advice or help. He had always relied on his grandfather, but now Elias was on his own, facing a future that seemed uncertain and frightening. The village, too, had begun to change. The once friendly faces he had known all his life now seemed distant. There was talk of the land being sold, of people leaving in search of better opportunities. The people of the village whispered about Elias, about his ability to manage the land and the flock. They spoke of the young man's grief and of the inevitable collapse of the family estate. Elias could feel the judgment in their eyes, their silent whispers. It was as if they had already written him off, believing he would not survive the challenges that life had dealt him. Despite the overwhelming odds, Elias refused to give up. He had inherited not just his grandfather's land and flock, but also his unwavering faith. The words of Psalm 23, which his grandfather had often recited, echoed in his mind, offering a small flicker of hope in the midst of his despair. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Elias clung to these words. Even when it seemed that the world around him was falling apart, he knew that he needed help, but he didn't know where to turn. The thought of asking for help from a village felt like an admission of failure. The fear of being seen as weak, of not living up to his grandfather's legacy, kept him isolated. But as the days passed, the situation worsened. The crops withered, the sheep grew weaker, and the village became more distant. Elias knew he could not face this battle alone. One stormy evening, as Elias sat alone in the cabin, his heart heavy with frustration and fear, he heard a knock on the door. Surprised, he stood up and opened it. There, standing in the rain, was an old friend from the village, someone he had not seen in years. "I heard about your troubles, Elias," the man said, his voice filled with concern. "I know things are tough, but you don't have to face this alone." Elias looked at the man, his eyes filled with doubt. "What do you mean?" he asked. "I'm offering my help," the man replied. "We all care about you. The village may have its own problems, but we're not going to let you struggle in silence. We'll work together to rebuild." Elias hesitated, unsure whether to trust the offer. But deep down, he knew that he couldn't do it alone. He felt the weight of his grandfather's legacy on his shoulders, and he realized that he was not the only one who cared about the land and the flock. As Elias agreed to accept help, a small spark of hope lit up in his heart. Maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't have to face the challenges ahead alone. He had faith that God would guide him, just as he had guided his grandfather all those years. Chapter 3. The Dark Valley and the Decision to Move Forward. The days that followed were filled with restless nights for Elias. The weight of the village's whispers, the failing crops, and the sickly sheep all weighed heavily on his heart. Despite the help he had received, he knew that the situation was dire. The land was still barren, and the future seemed uncertain. The help from his friend, though appreciated, was not enough to restore the land to its former glory. Elias needed something more, something beyond the physical and earthly solutions that had failed him. One stormy evening, as Elias stood by the window, staring out at the darkening sky, he realized that the village's home could no longer provide the answers he sought. The darkness of the clouds mirrored the darkness in his heart, and the howling wind seemed to speak of the turbulence within him. The path ahead was uncertain, but Elias knew one thing for sure. He could no longer wait for circumstances to change on their own. He had to take action. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind, a steady rhythm in the chaos. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." The valley of the shadow of death. The words were more than just a verse to Elias. They were a symbol of the struggle he faced. He knew that, just as his grandfather had done, he too must walk through the darkness, face his fears, and trust in God's guidance. Elias had heard the warnings from the villagers. The dark valley that lay between his home and the neighboring town was a place of danger and fear. The older generation spoke of thieves lurking in the shadows and wild animals stalking the unwary. No one in the village dared to cross the valley at night, and few people ventured through it even during the day. But Elias knew that he had no choice. The town was the only place where he could find the resources, help, and advice he desperately needed. If he stayed, his family's legacy would slip through his fingers. The land would be lost, and the flock would perish. With a deep breath, Elias made his decision. He would cross the valley. As night fell and the storm intensified, Elias packed a small bag with the essentials: a bit of bread, a flask of water, and a cloak to protect himself from rain. He couldn't shake the feeling that this journey would change him forever. It wasn't just a physical trek through the valley that frightened him. It was an emotional weight of the decision itself. He was walking away from everything he had known, from his home, from his past, and stepping into the unknown. Before leaving, Elias stood by the doorway of his small cabin. He closed his eyes, offering a prayer of surrender. "Lord, you are my shepherd," he whispered, "and I trust that you will guide me through this darkness. I walk not in fear, but in faith." As he stepped out into the night, the howling wind seemed to answer, urging him forward. He had no idea what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. He could not remain in the safety of his old life. He had to face the valley, just as the psalm had said, and he had to do it alone, with nothing but his faith to guide him. As Elias walked, the storm worsened, and the path became difficult to navigate. The ground beneath his feet was slick with rain, and the wind pushed against him with an intensity that made it hard to move forward. His heart raced, and doubt began to creep into his mind. What if he was making a mistake? What if the warnings of the villagers were true? What if he wasn't strong enough to survive the journey? But then, he remembered the psalm again. "I will fear no evil, for you are with me." Elias closed his eyes and took another step. The darkness seemed to grow thicker around him, but he knew that if he kept moving, he would eventually find the light. He was not alone. The darkness of the valley stretched on for what felt like hours, the only sound the pounding of the rain and the distant rumble of thunder. His steps were slow and cautious, but he refused to turn back. The path was treacherous, and there were moments when he stumbled, but he kept getting up, his heart fixed on the promise that God was with him. The valley might be dark, but it was not without hope. As Elias pressed forward, a faint light began to appear in the distance, growing brighter with each step. It wasn't much, but it was enough to renew his strength. The valley, though dark and foreboding, seemed less frightening now. Elias knew that he was closer to something, closer to the help he sought, closer to the change he needed, closer to the renewal of his faith. With the light in the distance, Elias continued his journey through the darkness, step by step, trusting that, even in the valley, God would not abandon him. Chapter 4. The Trials of the Valley and the Strength Within. Elias walked through the storm with each step feeling heavier than the last. The wind whipped violently around him, the sound of thunder booming above like an ominous warning. He could barely see beyond the rain that blurred his vision, and the path was becoming more difficult with every passing moment. His feet sank into mud, and his body was drenched from head to toe, but he refused to stop. The light in the distance, faint yet persistent, kept him going, urging him forward. In the darkest parts of the valley, Elias's doubts resurfaced. What was he doing here, walking alone in the middle of the night, through a place that no one dared to traverse? His heart began to race as the shadows around him seemed to grow darker, and the wind howled like the cries of lost souls. For a brief moment, fear took hold of him. He remembered the stories of thieves hiding in the shadows, waiting for unsuspecting travelers. What if they found him? What if the storm was too much for him to survive? He stopped in his tracks, his mind racing with fearful thoughts. His breath came in shallow gasps as the weight of the situation pressed down on him. The world felt so vast and empty in that moment, and he wondered if he had made a grave mistake. He thought of his grandfather, of the teachings that had been passed down to him, and how much he had relied on those words for strength. He thought of the psalm he had held so tightly to, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Elias closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe deeply. He could hear the sound of the wind, the rushing of the rain, but then, in the midst of it all, he heard something else. A voice, calm, steady, and comforting, echoed in his mind. "I am with you, always." The words were familiar, and in that moment, they brought him peace. His grandfather's voice, his own voice, and God's promise intertwined in his mind. With this new strength, Elias took another step forward. He would not turn back. He could not. His faith, though tested, was unwavering. He pressed on, pushing through the storm. The journey through the valley was a struggle, but with each step, Elias felt something shifting within him. His body was tired, but his spirit was growing stronger. The fears that had once seemed so overwhelming began to lose their grip on him. In the face of the valley's darkness, he was beginning to see the light. As the night stretched on, Elias felt the weight of the world slowly lift from his shoulders. The fear that had once consumed him now seemed distant. He began to realize that it was not the valley itself that had been his greatest challenge, but his own fear of it. The more he embraced the journey, the more he understood that it was not the destination that mattered. It was the strength he gained along the way. The valley was not just a physical obstacle. It was a spiritual trial that demanded trust and perseverance. Elias had feared the unknown, but in doing so, he had underestimated the power of faith to guide him through. The valley had become a test of his resolve, and the more he pushed forward, the more he found his confidence returning. But as the storm continued to rage, the path became steeper and the wind stronger. Elias could hear the distant roar of water flowing rapidly through a creek nearby, a sound that filled him with both hope and trepidation. He knew he was getting closer to the other side, but the last leg of the journey was not going to be easy. He struggled to keep his footing, his legs growing heavier with each step. The storm seemed to be intensifying, and the cold began to seep into his bones. For a moment, Elias thought of stopping, of seeking shelter from the storm. But something inside him told him to keep moving forward, to trust that the light he had seen earlier was real, that it was guiding him towards safety and hope. And so, Elias continued. The next stretch of the valley was the most treacherous yet. The ground beneath his feet became slippery, and the rain intensified into a torrential downpour. The light in the distance seemed further away, obscured by the storm. But Elias refused to give up. He had come too far, and now he knew that no matter how fierce the storm or how deep the valley, he could face it with faith as his guide. Just as his strength seemed to be dwindling, Elias stumbled upon something unexpected. A narrow path winding up the side of the valley. It was barely visible, hidden beneath the heavy foliage. But it was there. The light that had once seemed so distant now seemed to shine a little brighter. With renewed determination, Elias took the path, his heart swelling with hope. This was the way forward. As he climbed the path, the storm seemed to relent, the wind dying down and the rain tapering off. The clouds above parted ever so slightly, allowing a faint glow to break through. It wasn't much, but it was enough to reassure him that he was on the right path. The valley was still dark, but the light was closer now, and with it came a renewed sense of purpose. Elias knew that the journey ahead would not be easy, but he had learned something important in the darkness of the valley. He was stronger than he had ever realized. His faith had carried him through, and with each step, he was closer to the peace and renewal he sought. Chapter 5. The Dawn of Hope and the Promise of Renewal. After what seemed like an eternity, Elias's weary feet finally found solid ground. The path had been treacherous, the storm unforgiving, but now, as the light grew stronger, he knew he had crossed the darkest part of his journey. The valley, which had once seemed so vast and terrifying, now appeared smaller in the distance. The clouds had begun to break apart, and the once heavy downpour was now a light drizzle. The chill of the storm that had gripped him for so long slowly began to lift. Elias took a deep breath, his chest swelling with relief. He looked around and realized that the valley, though harsh and unforgiving, had not defeated him. In fact, it had transformed him. He was no longer the same young man who had entered the valley hours ago, full of doubt and fear. He had faced his inner darkness, walked through it, and emerged stronger on the other side. As Elias stepped into the clearing, the first rays of the dawn broke through the dissipating clouds, casting a golden light over the landscape. The world around him seemed come alive again, the air fresh and full of promise. The green fields ahead stretched as far as the eye could see, and in the distance, he could see the outlines of the town he had been heading toward. For the first time in what felt like ages, Elias felt a sense of peace. The anxiety and tension that had accompanied him on his journey seemed to dissolve with the morning light. The storm had passed, and though the scars of his struggle were still with him, they no longer weighed him down. Instead, they reminded him of how far he had come, how much he had grown. With a newfound strength, Elias began to walk toward the town, each step feeling lighter than the last. The town that had once seemed so distant now felt within reach. As he approached, he could see the familiar houses and streets that had once been a part of his life. Yet, the town seemed different now. It felt more welcoming, more alive. Perhaps it was the light of dawn, or perhaps it was the inner transformation Elias had experienced. But the world around him seemed more vibrant than ever. As he entered the town, Elias felt a sense of gratitude well up inside him. He had faced the darkness, both external and internal, and had come through it with a renewed sense of purpose. The journey had not been easy, but it taught him lessons he would carry with him for the rest of his life. He made his way to the small inn where he could find a warm meal and some rest. As he sat down, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The valley had been a test of his strength, his faith, and his resolve, but it had also been a place of renewal. In the midst of the storm, Elias had learned that even when the world seems darkest, there is always hope, and that hope often comes from within. It was his faith, his trust in God, and his willingness to keep moving forward that had carried him through. Elias now understood the meaning of the psalm his grandfather had often recited. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul." The psalm was not just a comfort in times of trouble. It was a promise that no matter what, God would always be with him, guiding him through life's darkest valleys and leading him into places of peace and renewal. With a full stomach and a heart at peace, Elias knew that his journey was far from over. But for now, he could rest. He had faced a valley, and it had not defeated him. The road ahead would still be difficult, but he was no longer the same person who had entered the valley. He had found the strength to persevere, and he knew that as long as he had faith, he would continue to move forward. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Elias looked out the window and smiled. The valley was behind him, but the lessons it had taught him would stay with him forever. No matter what challenges lay ahead, he knew that with God by his side, nothing would ever be impossible. Chapter 6: Restoration and the Power of Faith. The town was bustling with activity as Elias walked through its streets, his eyes filled with determination and hope. The storm had passed, and the warmth of the sun on his face felt like a sign that his journey was leading him to something new. He had crossed a dark valley, both physically and spiritually, and had come out the other side stronger. But his journey was far from over. His land, his flock, and his future still required rebuilding, and Elias knew that he could not do it alone. As he entered the town, he was greeted by a few familiar faces, people he had known in his youth, before his grandfather's death. They had all heard of his struggles and the difficulties he had faced, but now, seeing him in person, there was a new light in his eyes, a light of hope and perseverance. Elias had changed, and they could see it. He made his way to the local market, where farmers and traders from nearby villages gathered to sell their goods. The air was filled with the scent of fresh produce, and the sound of people bartering echoed through the square. Elias took a deep breath, his heart swelling with gratitude. He was no longer the broken young man who had left the village days ago. He had found something within himself, something that had been dormant for a long time. He had found the strength to move forward. He approached a local farmer, a man who had been a friend of his grandfather's. The farmer had always been kind to Elias, and he had heard of the young man's struggles in recent weeks. Elias knew that if anyone could offer advice on how to restore the land, it was this man. "Hello, Elias." The farmer greeted him warmly. "I've heard about what you've been going through. It's good to see you here, alive and well. What brings you to town?" Elias smiled, the weight of his journey still heavy on his shoulders, but lighter than before. "I need help," he said, his voice steady but filled with humility. "I need to restore my land and my flock. I don't know where to start, but I can't do it alone." The farmer nodded, his face softening with understanding. "I know what you've been through, Elias. Your grandfather was a good man, and he taught you well. It won't be easy, but there is hope. With the right guidance and hard work, the land can heal, and your flock can grow strong again. You just need to start with the basics." Elias listened intently as the farmer gave him advice on how to care for the land and the flock. He offered practical solutions, ways to restore the soil, how to nurse the sheep back to health, and how to plant new crops that would help rejuvenate the land. It wasn't a quick fix, and Elias knew that it would take time. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of clarity. He had a plan, and more importantly, he had the faith to see it through. After speaking with the farmer, Elias spent the next several days in town, gathering supplies and making the necessary arrangements to restore his land. As he worked, he met other people who offered their help, people who had heard of his journey and wanted to lend a hand. The village, which had once felt distant and judgmental, now seemed to embrace him with open arms. The darkness that had once hung over his life was slowly dissipating, and in its place, there was a sense of community and support. With each day that passed, Elias put his plan into action. He worked tirelessly, following the advice of the farmer and the other villagers who had offered their assistance. The soil, though dry, slowly began to show signs of renewal. The crops, though weak, began to sprout. His flock, once weak and frail, started to regain their strength. It wasn't an easy process, and there were setbacks along the way, but Elias had learned a valuable lesson during his journey through the valley. That true restoration takes time, patience, and faith. As weeks turned into months, Elias's land began to thrive again. The once barren fields now bore the fruits of his labor, and the sheep grew strong and healthy. The village, too, seemed to flourish. There was a sense of unity in the air, a shared understanding that they had all been through difficult times, but they were stronger together. One day, as Elias stood on a hill overlooking his land, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had come so far, and while there was still work to be done, he knew that the hardest part of the journey was behind him. He had learned to trust in God's guidance, to face his fears, and to rely on the strength of his faith. He had learned that even in the darkest moments, there was always hope, and that restoration, both of the land and of the soul, was possible. Elias turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the sun was setting behind the mountains. It was a beautiful sight, one that filled him with peace. The valley had tested him, but had also led him to this moment of renewal, of hope, and of faith restored. And as he stood there, looking at the land he had worked so hard to restore, Elias knew that, with God as his shepherd, he would never again fear the valleys he had to cross. He had walked to the darkest one, and emerged stronger, ready to face whatever lay ahead. Chapter 7. Reflections of the Journey and the Promise of New Beginnings. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting its golden light over the restored fields of Elias's land. The once barren soil was now full of life, and the sheep grazed peacefully under fading light. Elias stood on the hill that overlooked his farm, his hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed the fruits of his labor, the journey he had undertaken. The trials he had faced and the faith that had carried him through had brought him to this very moment, a moment of quiet peace and reflection. Elias could still remember the day he had set out on his journey through the dark valley. At that time, he had been uncertain, overwhelmed by grief, fear, and the weight of responsibility. The path ahead had seemed unclear, and the valley had loomed like an insurmountable obstacle. But now, as he stood in the light of the evening sun, he realized how far he had come. The valley, once a symbol of fear and uncertainty, was now a part of his past, a memory of a time when he had learned the true strength of his faith. He thought back to the days when his grandfather had taught him the ways of shepherding, when the world had seemed so simple and his life had been full of innocence and joy. But life, as it often does, had taken unexpected turns. The loss of his parents and his grandfather had left him with a heavy heart, and the burden of responsibility had weighed on him. The land had begun to wither, and the sheep had grown weak. The world around him had seemed dark, and he felt like a lost sheep searching for a shepherd. But in the midst of his darkest moments, when the weight of fear and doubt had almost consumed him, he had found the strength to move forward. It was in the dark valley, when all seemed lost, that Elias had discovered the depth of his faith. The words of the psalm that his grandfather had so often recited had become his anchor. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul." It was these words that had carried him through the storm, and they had become a living truth in his life. As Elias stood there, looking at the land he had worked so hard to restore, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had learned that restoration was not just about the land or the flock. It was about the restoration of his heart, his spirit, and his relationship with God. He had learned that no matter how dark the valley, no matter how steep the path, God was with him every step of the way. The journey had not been easy, but it had been necessary. It had shaped him into the man he was now, a man who had learned to trust in God's timing, to rely on faith, and to face fear with courage. Elias turned toward the small cabin where he had grown up, the place where his grandfather had raised him and taught him the ways of the shepherd. The cabin was humble, but it was a place filled with memories. As he walked toward it, he thought of all the lessons his grandfather had imparted. Lessons not just about the land, but about life and faith. His grandfather had always said, "A shepherd does not lead by force, but by love. He guides his flock with patience, wisdom, and care." Elias now understood what that meant. The shepherd's role was not just protect and provide for the sheep, but to guide them with compassion, understanding, and a steady hand. He smiled as he reached the door of the cabin. The journey he had taken had not only restored his land, but it had restored his soul. He was no longer the fearful young man who had left the village, unsure of his future. He had emerged from the valley as a new person, a person who had learned to trust in God, to trust in others, and to trust in himself. As Elias entered the cabin, he felt a wave of peace wash over him. He had come full circle. The valley had been a place of testing, but it had also been a place of growth. It had shown him that even in the darkest moments, there was always hope, and that God's presence was with him, guiding him every step of the way. He sat down by the fire, the warmth of the flames reflecting the warmth in his heart. He knew that the road ahead would still have its challenges, but he no longer feared the valleys he would have to cross. He had learned that, with faith, perseverance, and trust in God's guidance, anything was possible. He had walked through the darkness and into the light, and he knew that the same God who had brought him through the storm would continue to guide him in the days to come. Elias closed his eyes, offering a prayer of gratitude for the lessons learned, for the strength gained, and for the restoration of both his land and his spirit. He knew that, with God as his shepherd, he would never walk alone. Epilogue: the promise of new beginnings. As the years passed, Elias's land flourished, and his flock grew strong. The village that had once seemed distant and judgmental now stood with him, supported his efforts to rebuild and renew. The relationships he had once thought lost were restored, and Elias became a pillar of strength and faith in the community. But more than that, Elias' story became a testament to the power of faith and perseverance. His journey through the dark valley had taught him that no matter how difficult life may seem, there is always hope, and there is always a path forward. He had faced the storms of life, and with God's guidance, he had emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. And as he continued to walk his path, Elias knew that with God as his shepherd, nothing would ever be impossible. The valleys, though they may come, would no longer be places of fear, but places of transformation, places where his faith would continue to grow and guide him toward new beginnings.